Welcome to the debate. Our focus today really stems from the examination and the deep dive of systemic economic and colonial pressures in various Asian societies. We're looking at how individuals respond when these core social frameworks start to crumble. We're looking at that crucial moment, when traditional structures fail, when that daikoku bashira, that metaphorical pillar of the Japanese household collapses, or when local wages are just simply incapable of supporting a family. People pivot to these highly commercialized survival strategies.
And that pivot is exactly it. That moment of radical, often painful change, that's where we find the deepest tension. We really have to analyze the fundamental nature of that action.
Precisely. So we're asking, when these high-pressure commercialized systems emerge, things like the global marriage market or the Japanese pseudo-romance economy, do the individual acts of survival that result from that represent genuine individual agency? Or are they just compulsory compliance with a new, hyper-efficient architecture of systemic exploitation?
And the two positions, well, they couldn't be more opposed.
I'm going to argue that these choices are strategic. They're rational acts of resilience and calculated agency really designed to carve out some autonomy in a world that fundamentally denies it.
And I come at it from a different angle. I'll argue that the degree of structural coercion in these environments is so overwhelming that these choices are in fact compulsory compliance and that they extract a deep and unavoidable psychological cost.
I see why you might categorize these decisions as purely compliant, but I really frame them as highly rational strategies that demonstrate true choice. When the state or the local economy fails, the decisions made by women seeking, say, overseas employment or foreign partners are not acts of submission. They are clear-eyed, proactive moves. For a Filipina, the pursuit of an overseas Philippine worker role, an OFW role, or a foreign partner, while certainly painful, is the clearest, most reliable economic survival calculus there is.
That's an interesting point, but I really struggle with calling something a clear-eyed choice when the only alternative is, grinding poverty.
Because the outcome is transformative, and it's intentional. These decisions often result in Balik Bayan status, that lauded, respected position of returning home or sending money back, having successfully provided. It is the only reliable way to lift an entire family out of poverty when local wages have just flatlined. And then, look at Japan. We see these genuine acts of aesthetic defiance. Subcultures like Lolita, they reject the aesthetic compliance acquired by the traditional male gaze, choosing aesthetics for self-expression. Or the Age-jo, the bar hostesses, they have successfully professionalized and monetized their emotional labor, achieving financial independence outside that defunct patriarchal structure. This is agency because it's a deliberate rejection of rigid societal expectations.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that the existence of a high-cost pathway negates the coercion. The economic and colonial structures dictate the terms of survival so profoundly that these so-called choices are simply required compliance, ensuring profitability for the exploiters or the systems that they support. Structural failures, the immense cost of inter-island travel in the Philippines, the collapse of lifetime employment in Japan, they create the vulnerability. The demand side, whether it's the salarymen seeking manufactured intimacy or the passport bros, uses sheer currency strength and economic leverage and the terrifying ability to just easily find a replacement to enforce that compliance.
But they are still successfully navigating that leverage.
And that navigation comes at a devastating psychological cost. This reliance on purely transactional relationships, it results in depersonalization, diminished self-esteem, and this self-hatred loop driven by the colonial mirror. We see the concrete evidence in the ubiquity and high cost of skin-lightening products. In certain markets, like the Japanese AV industry, financial coercion and legal loopholes ensure the product flow, prioritizing system efficiency above the performer's genuine consent. The system manufactures the commodity, and then it profits from the necessity of compliance.
Okay, let's ground this specifically in the dynamics of the global marriage market, where the agency I'm describing is, I think, purely rational and observable. The calculus is brutally simple. economic security trumps other factors. Consider the case of the Filipino who explicitly chose the significantly older partner based purely on his economic provision, rejecting the younger, more attractive foreigner who just earned less. That is a clear signal that the economics of provision absolutely trump physical attraction in this survival equation. She's strategically choosing the lauded provider-gentleman archetype that her local economy has failed to produce. She's actively managing the demand.
That's a compelling argument based on the data, I'll grant you. But have you considered that this is necessity disguised as choice? That it's driven by desperate structural constraints? The wage differential is extreme. Local wages are often 5, even 10 times lower than overseas opportunities. When the choice is between destitution and the walking ATM, is that not the very definition of a coerced choice? I mean, where's the real freedom in that scarcity? We saw data confirming men often spend 25 to 40,000 pesos a month supporting a partner and her family before marriage even occurs. That establishes a clear financial contract. The implicit understanding of financial provision, it places the man squarely in that stigmatized sugar daddy category, confirming the deeply transactional foundation.
I take your point that scarcity restricts the field of choice, but the decision within that restricted field is still autonomous. It's an entrepreneurial spirit adapting to global demand. They are prioritizing the long-term economic provisioning of their kin group over immediate desires, which demonstrates a fierce strategic agency.
And the structural conditions ensure that entrepreneurial spirit is channeled directly into vulnerability. Okay, so we've discussed global survival. Let's narrow the focus now to Japan and the architecture of monetized intimacy. The commercial architecture in places like Kabukicho is designed precisely to monetize the emotional crisis resulting from systemic collapse. The host clubs, they don't sell sex. They sell cheap pseudo-romance and validation, preying on the profound loneliness and emotional hunger of women whose traditional relationship scripts have completely failed.
But emotional labor is a legitimate, recognized form of labor in a modern service economy.
Yes, but look at the scale of the vulnerability being exploited. Consider the Akemi example. She spent over $1 million on a single host. $1 million. She rationalized this immense expenditure as necessary mental support. This scale demonstrates a voluntary submission to a new set of commercial rules that prioritize extracting staggering profit from deep emotional need. This is a symptom of a psychological crisis that's been expertly monetized by a clever system.
I'm not convinced by that, because it ignores the societal demand for functional, modern alternatives. Citizens in Japan didn't ask for a return to the collapsed patriarchy. They prioritized attractive workplaces and employment opportunities. The age-Joe's successful commercialization is a modern, empowering path to financial independence, filling the void left by that failed economy. They used magazines like Kokomagaya to legitimize their work, making it a viable, high-status path. They are being pragmatic. And furthermore, subcultures like Lolita demonstrate that aesthetic defiance is possible. They deliberately reject the aesthetic compliance required by the traditional male gaze, choosing an aesthetic for self-expression and pure approval. That is true autonomy.
Their Lolita choice is aesthetic defiance, sure, but the Age Joe example is monetization through aesthetic compliance to a Eurocentric standard. Their success is built on adherence to westernized beauty ideals, brown hair, three-dimensional makeup, to increase their earning power. So the system broke the traditional male breadwinner, forcing women to monetize their emotional labor, and the efficiency of that monetization is dictated by how closely they adhere to an imported, foreign beauty standard. The system simply substituted one compliance metric for another, which leads us directly to the core of our final contention, the immense psychological cost of conforming to colonial ideals.
I acknowledge the pain inherent in this colonial mirror. But let's highlight the act of defiance against the rigid, oppressive Maria Clara archetype, that colonial ideal of the subservient, chaste Filipino woman. Coded resistance, sometimes called emotional warfare by young, educated women, is actively used to claw back autonomy from restrictive family and societal structures. They fight internal battles to define themselves. The resilience shown by abuse survivors who focus on fierce maternal love and internal faith, literally praying, "I don't want to go home crazy," that shows a powerful spiritual agency rooted in identity preservation, fighting systems designed to erase their self-concept.
The struggle is real, absolutely, but we have to ask,
How effective is this resistance when the system has successfully embedded its values into the individual's psyche? The psychological tax remains astronomical. When agency is compromised by this psychological battlefield, it is hard to laud it as a victory. We heard that stark, undeniable quote from an interviewee, "Lighter is better, it was just understood, more superior." The massive, ubiquitous skin lightening industry demonstrates the high cost of trying to conform to the imported Eurocentric ideal, the MISTA. This is the psychological internalization of foreign aesthetic standards. Internalizing these colonial metrics creates a profound, continuous wound that fundamentally undermines self-esteem and identity coherence. The battle for identity is being fought inside the mind, day after day, with the metrics of victory established by the standards of the colonizer.
But that constant struggle for identity, that persistent fight against erasure, that is precisely the resilience I'm describing. It proves that the human spirit cannot be fully extinguished by corruption or coercion. The capacity to retain persistent optimism and fight for justice, even when the state fails to deliver, is the most profound underlying agency. It allows for survival when all other systems fail.
I would counter that the structural failure, the chronic budget constraints, the low local wages, the dynastic corruption, it ensures this cycle of necessity continues, forcing people into this perpetual state of identity warfare. The systems of power and external projection have succeeded. They have embedded themselves right into the individual's sense of worth. So true, uncompromised agency remains a constant, exhausting struggle, not a settled reality.
The struggle itself, though, the refusal to surrender the self-concept, that is the act of being.
And the struggle is the relentless daily cost of systemic failure.
This discussion, I think, clearly illuminates the profound tension that was embedded in the material we analyzed in the deep dive.
Indeed. And the core question remains whether the self-concept, fractured as it is by external projection and dictated necessity, can ever achieve true redefinition and coherence when the very conditions of survival are so fundamentally constrained by systemic economic need.